Over the past 4 decades, Professor Bigger has been a teacher, supervisor, chaplain, canon of Christ Church, and among all of this has served faithfully in his vocation as a Christian ethicist. In this final role, he has contributed substantially to ethical thought and practice across a wide range of moral issues. From his early field-defining work in the ethics of Karl Barth to his latest careful parsing of the question of rights, Professor Bigger has navigated an extraordinarily wide terrain of questions while always maintaining a careful balance between theory and practice. While he has become well known among popular audiences for his defenses of just war and more recently for defenses of justice within empires, his early work was shaped by his time in Ireland and the role forgiveness and reconciliation play in establishing a just peace among nations and neighborhoods torn by conflict.
In other words, Nigel has always been concerned to do moral theology from the ground up, reclaiming casuistry by forcing us to attend to the details of concrete moral questions. Yet he's also done work from the top down, I think, believing that the vocation of the Christian ethicist includes supporting people whose positions and circumstances force them to make complex and consequential moral decisions, usually without the luxury of time and reflection afforded by the scholar's chair. So to that end, Nigel has attended to the kinds of questions raised in the emergency room, on the battlefield, in the Houses of Parliament, the judges' chambers, and the college senior common room, but also those raised in his office by vexed graduate students and postdocs who came to him not only for academic formation, but also guidance on questions of personal vocation and professional direction. Those grateful graduate students, of course, as we've said, include Matt and myself, as well as 4 of our 5 session moderators, the 5th being a former visiting McDonald fellow, but all of us grateful to Nigel in our own ways for the counsel he has given. Now, in order to honor Nigel's work and his faithfulness to his vocation, we have asked our conference participants to consider what faithfulness to the call of Christ demands within the political, economic, and social orders within which we live. So our guiding question has been, where can Christians turn for help in discerning the call of Christ in their own sphere and circumstance? And how can Christian ethicists serve those forced to make complex and consequential moral decisions? So our speakers will address this subject in several of the arenas and fields that Professor Bigger himself has contributed to, but in ways we hope that develop their own constructive contributions and proposals to the questions, which is to say, in ways that are faithful to their own vocation as Christian ethicists and practitioners. So we are grateful to each of them, and we are grateful to each of you for joining us as we celebrate the work of Professor Bigger and consider together what it means to be faithful to the call of Christ under the conditions of our humanity. So with that said, we are delighted to turn it over to our first chair and moderator, Ed Brooks.
Thank you, Brian. Matt, what a privilege to be together with this group and at this conference. I'm Ed Brooks. I work with the Oxford Character Project here at the University of Oxford. The Oxford Character Project was founded in partnership with the McDonald Centre in 2014 and has been championed, supervised, supported by Professor Bigger at every step of its journey to date. Nigel, thank you so much for your work and the work that you've enabled us to do on character and leadership here at the university. It is a pleasure to be introducing our first 2 speakers this morning. What an incredible array of speakers we have before us, and some incredible, some exciting themes as well on the programme. Our first 2 speakers will speak in turn with questions in the middle, so please do be ready for those. We have Professor Gerry McKenny. First of all, Gerry is the Walter Professor of Theology at the University of Notre Dame, followed by Charles Mathews, who's the Carolyn M. Barber Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Virginia. There are fuller biographies in the programme, so please do look at those. But without further ado, I'm delighted to hand over to Gerry McKenny. Gerry, thank you so much. And we hand over to you to speak on Barthian Thomism.
I'd like to begin by expressing my appreciation for Nigel Bigger, for his support of me early in my career when arguably there was no reason for him to support me, and later in my career when there was arguably even less reason for him to support me. Also for his support, his generous support of students of mine. I'd like to thank him furthermore for his unsurpassed model of academic rigor and respectful disagreement. And finally, I'd like to express my appreciation for his faithfulness to the call. In characteristic Anglican fashion, Nigel Bigger describes his approach to moral theology as a via media that combines elements of the moral theologies of Thomas Aquinas and Karl Barth. The Thomist element affirms natural human goods that can be described without theological reference. The Barthian element affirms the necessity of acknowledging Christ, whether explicitly or implicitly, for an understanding of human goods as an ordered whole. As Eric Gregory notes, what Bigger wants is an autonomous human good that is nevertheless fully intelligible only in a comprehensive theological vision centered on Christ. Barthian Thomism thus attempts to do justice to two distinct demands of moral theology. On the one hand, moral theologians believe that the human good was established with God's creation of human beings. What they say about good or right action pertains to human beings as the kind of creature they are, not just to a distinctively Christian form of life. On the other hand, moral theology as a discipline rests on the claim that the human good, like all creaturely things, must ultimately be understood in relation to the God who wears the face of Jesus, to use Bigger's felicitous phrase. What moral theologians say about good and right action is said in light of the God who became human in Christ. The recent history of the field of moral theology could be narrated as a struggle to balance these two demands, and two prominent examples show how Barthianism and Thomism are at the center of the struggle. In his 1993 encyclical Veritatis Splendor, John Paul II's depiction of the moral life as growth into the perfection of Christ was directed in part at a form of Thomism that had reduced the human good to what is commensurate with human nature. Meanwhile, the recovery of natural law and virtue in contemporary Protestant moral theology opposes a form of Barthianism that reduces the human good to what is revealed in Christ or to an ecclesial form of life. Unsurprisingly, it has occurred to thoughtful moral theologians today, including Bigger, that a way beyond these imbalances might be found by combining a Thomistic affirmation of the creaturely character of the human good with a Barthian emphasis on its Christological determination. However, Barthian Thomism, as these efforts may collectively be called, rests on two faulty assumptions. The first assumption is that neither Aquinas nor Barth meets both demands, and that each must therefore be complemented by the other. In fact, as we will see, both Aquinas and Barth unite the creaturely and the Christological, and they do so in remarkably similar ways. Neither lacks something that the other complements. The second assumption is that elements of each can be combined in a coherent way. But as we will also see, for all their similarities, Aquinas and Barth unite the creaturely and the Christological in incompatible ways, which preclude a coherent combination of elements of each. Aquinas and Barth run on parallel lines, but in moral theology, as in geometry, parallel lines do not converge. I will conclude that to balance the two demands, moral theologians should look neither to Aquinas nor to Barth. I begin with the claim that both Aquinas and Barth meet both demands. First, both affirm the Christological determination of the good as decisive. More precisely, both hold that the human good, in its most proper sense, is fully realized in Christ, and that its realization in Christ is normative for other human beings who realize it for themselves by conforming to Christ in their own actions. Second, both hold that the human good, so understood, is the good of the human creature as the kind of creature it is, and that there is a form of goodness to be found in the exercise of the characteristics that make the human being what it is, even apart from Christ. The first point, that the human good is fully realized in Christ and that its realization in Christ is normative for other human beings, is obviously the case for Barth. According to Barth, God resolves from eternity to be gracious to human beings. Far from abandoning them or leaving them to their own devices, God resolves to be for them, to take up their cause as God's own cause, and determines them to be those whom God is for. God's eternal resolve is accomplished in time in Christ, who is not only God for human beings, but also the human being whom God is for. In acting as one whom God is for and not as one who must be for himself, Christ conforms to God's gracious action and thus accomplishes the human good. What remains for other human beings is to endorse his realization of the good by acting in ways that conform to it. Aquinas' position appears to be far removed from Barth's. The comprehensive treatment of human action in the second part of his Summa Theologica barely mentions Christ. However, Thomas Shanley and Joseph Warrico have noted that when Aquinas describes the structure of the Summa early in its first part, he states that the second part will consider the movement of the human being to God, while the third part will consider Christ as the way by which human beings move to God. The second part clarifies that what human beings move toward in this life is the beatific vision, in which God is known and loved directly. To know and love God in this way is beyond the natural capacity of any creature and requires the elevation of human capacities by grace, which in this life occurs as divinely infused virtues and gifts of the Holy Spirit enable human beings to act in ways that conduce to the attainment of this good. The third part then presents Christ, who enjoys the beatific vision in this life, as the exemplar of the virtues and actions by which other human beings move toward the beatific vision. In conforming to Christ, human beings are conformed to God, and to conform to Christ is to take his virtues and acts as the norm of their own virtues and acts as they move toward their ultimate good. For both Aquinas and Barth, then, the human good in its most proper sense is realized in Christ, and its realization in Christ is normative for other human beings who realize it for themselves, to the extent that they do, by conduct that conforms to it. To be sure, Aquinas and Barth differ in their conceptions of the good that is realized by Christ and normative for other human beings, and these distinct conceptions of the good provide reasons for choosing one over the other. But the choice is between two accounts of a Christologically determined good, not between an autonomous good and a Christologically determined good. Aquinas and Barth also agree on the second point, that the good realized in Christ is the good of the human creature as the kind of creature it is. This is an agreement on two claims. First, human beings were created to enjoy the good that Christ realizes, and the characteristics that make them a creature of their kind are oriented to it. Although their attainment of it depends on grace, it is nevertheless their good as the kind of creature they are, and it is enjoyed in the exercise of the capacities that make them the kind of creature they are. Second, while the good realized in Christ is the human good in the most proper sense, there is also a form of human good that is commensurate with human nature considered simply in itself, apart from Christ and the work of grace. These claims most obviously apply to Aquinas, for whom the human good is the perfection of human capacities, which consists in their development and exercise. It is true that the highest perfection of human capacities, exemplified in Christ, exceeds the capability of human beings and is attainable only by grace. Yet, the creature who is elevated by grace is this creature with its characteristic capacities. The concept of the creature who is elevated by grace therefore includes the concept of the development and exercise of its capacities in accordance with its intrinsic capabilities. This is the concept of a perfection that is commensurate with its nature, a perfection that is attained, to the extent that it is, by virtues which human beings acquire by their own actions. However, because it is not the fullest development and expression of human capacities, this is a lesser perfection, and the acquired virtues that conduce to it are therefore not virtues in the most proper sense. Barth is in surprising agreement with Aquinas on these points. For Barth, actions that conform to God's grace in Christ are possible only by grace, yet they are the actions of human beings who exercise the capacities of a creature of their kind, capacities which were created precisely for conformity to grace. Barth also recognizes the occurrence of actions that do not conform to grace, but are nevertheless genuine expressions of these creaturely capacities. These actions exhibit a kind of goodness, even as they fall short of the true good. Barth's treatment of agape and eros nicely illustrates this point. For Barth, the characteristic that most fundamentally marks human beings as the kind of creature they are is their social nature. To be human is to be a human being with other human beings. God created human beings with this characteristic as a condition for the realization of God's grace to human beings in Christ. It is because human being is being with other humans that God can be for human beings by being with them as a fellow human being in Christ. Acts of agape and eros both exercise the characteristic of being for the other. Acts of agape, in which one human being acts for another, conform to Christ's being for us and are thus good in the proper sense. Acts of eros fall short of this true good. Yet insofar as they revel in the joy of being with another, they express the characteristic of being with the other, which grace activates in the case of acts of agape. So while acts of eros are not good in the proper sense of conformity to grace, they are praiseworthy as genuine expressions of the fundamental creaturely characteristic that is oriented to God's grace as the proper human good. For both Aquinas and Barth, then, to speak of the human good is to speak of the creature whose good it is. While the human good in the most proper sense is attainable only by grace, it is the good of this creature and expresses the characteristics that make it a creature of its kind, characteristics that were created for this good and are oriented to it, even as they depend on grace to attain it. Meanwhile, the expression of these characteristics apart from grace constitutes a lesser but still genuine human good. It should now be clear that both Aquinas and Barth combine the demands of the creaturely and the Christological dimensions of the human good and do so in remarkably similar ways. No, there is no need for a Barthian Thomist hybrid to meet the two demands. However, we will now see that Aquinas and Barth combine these demands in mutually incompatible ways. They run on parallel lines, which frustrates any attempt at convergence. In a nutshell, the Aquinas line moves from nature to grace, showing how the true human good that grace brings about perfects human beings as the kind of creature they are. God creates a creature whose nature is perfected by grace. The Barth line moves from grace to nature, explaining the normative significance of characteristically human features as conditions for God to be for human beings. God resolves from eternity to be gracious and creates human beings with a nature that enables God to realize God's resolve. So, taking Aquinas first, as we have seen, for Aquinas, the human good is the perfection of human capacities, whether it be the lesser perfection humans are capable of by their natural capacities alone, or the highest perfection, which requires the elevation of their natural capacities by grace, but is still the perfection of those capacities. The elevation of human nature by grace can be understood only in light of the nature that is elevated. Grace is intelligible only through nature. An important implication follows, which is that for Aquinas, the human good is intelligible to pagans as well as to Christians. This is the case not only for the good that is commensurate with human nature, but also for the ultimate good. Although the elevation of human capacities by grace is a mystery for Christians and pagans alike, insofar as it is comprehensible as the perfection of human capacities, it is intelligible to both Christians and pagans. It is instructive on this point that Aquinas argues for the beatific vision as the true human good, not by appealing to revelation, but by showing how it satisfies Aristotle's conditions for what counts as the ultimate good of a rational creature. For Barth, God's grace to human beings in Christ as the true human good is not the perfection of human capacities, nor is it the answer to the question of what perfects human beings as the kind of creature they are. It is only when we understand God's grace to human beings to be their good that we can understand the normative significance of human nature as the condition for this good to be realized in them. To return to our example, we must know that God is for human beings in Christ as their fellow human being, in order to know what the normative significance of the nature of human being as being with the other is, or even to know that it has normative significance. Christ's being for other human beings is not the perfection of their capacity for being with one another. Rather, their being with one another is the condition for Christ to be with them. Nature is intelligible only through grace. And again, this has an important implication, namely that both the human good itself and the normative significance of nature as the condition of its realization will be intelligible only to Christians. Non-Christians do the good, but unwittingly, without understanding it and choosing it as the good it is. So there was a bump on the Barth line. But we also find bumps on the Aquinas line. Aquinas' account of the human good begins with the human being as a rational creature and inquires into what perfects it as the kind of creature it is. As we have seen, the concept of the kind of creature it is implies a concept of the good that perfects it as a creature of its kind, with its intrinsic capabilities. This concept of the lesser perfection will in some way be implied in the account of the true perfection by grace, which exceeds the creature's capabilities, but is still its perfection. Two implications follow. First, the concept of a natural perfection affords the pagan, who is excluded from grace, a genuine human good. At the same time, however, this good involves a lesser perfection of human capacities, and it is therefore inferior to the good afforded the Christian by grace. Second, to say that an account of the natural good will in some way be implied in an account of the true good is to allude to the difficulty of clarifying just how these goods relate to one another. The relation of the natural and the supernatural good is endlessly contested by Thomists, and one suspects that is because the tension in holding that God created human beings both with a good that is commensurate with their nature and for a good that exceeds their nature is simply unresolvable. Reversing Aquinas, Barth begins with God's grace to human beings in Christ and explains human characteristics as creaturely conditions for grace to be realized in human beings. Because human nature was created solely for the realization of grace, there is no perfection that is commensurate with it. The eros of the pagan is not a perfection of human sociality, but simply an expression of it. It exhibits the goodness of sociality as a condition of grace, but it does not realize the good of conformity to grace, which is the only good sociality was created for. The goodness of sociality consists entirely in its status as a creaturely condition of grace. There is no good proper to it. Thus, while Barth finds eros and other graceless expressions of human nature praiseworthy, he fails to clarify the sense in which they are genuine goods. He thus affords the pagan not an inferior good, but no real good at all. At the same time, Barth smooths out the bumps on the Aquinas line. Because human characteristics for Barth are directly oriented to the good of God's grace in Christ, and not to a connatural good, they do not require any elevation by grace, but are suited for conformity to grace just as they are created. Grace empowers natural capacities, enabling them to do what they were created to do. It does not elevate them above what they were created to do. The inability of human capacities to conform to God's grace in Christ is due to the corruption of sin, not to the limitations of nature. Two implications follow. First, because nature does not need to be elevated, but needs only to be restored to its created capability, Barth finds it natural to affirm that human actions may implicitly conform to grace without explicitly doing so. The pagan, like the Christian, depends on grace to perform such actions. But because grace empowers capacities in their created state, rather than elevating them above their created state, their occurrence is intelligible in a way that the occurrence of a pagan acting from an infused virtue is not. So even as he denies pagans an inferior good, Barth allows them implicit realizations of the true good. The pagan and the Christian exhibit the same good, one implicitly, the other explicitly. Second, because human capacities are directly oriented towards the true good of conformity to grace, Barth avoids the insoluble problem of how to relate a natural good to a supernatural good. Nature was made for grace, and the one human good of conformity to God's grace in Christ is the good of the human creature, precisely as God created it. In short, the Aquinas and Barth lines are non-converging, and neither line is a smooth one. But the bumps on both lines could be avoided by setting out on a third line. This line would characterize the human good as conformity not to God's grace, which assists human beings in attaining the good, but to divine qualities such as wisdom, justice, and goodness, which are recognizable as good apart from revelation, but are definitively revealed in Christ as their exemplar and source for other humans. With Aquinas, this line would understand the good as the perfection by grace of natural human capacities, rendering it intelligible to Christian and pagan alike. And with Barth, it would hold these natural capacities to be oriented to the good in their created form, eliminating the need for grace to elevate them, doing away with the distinction between a natural and a supernatural good, and allowing the pagan to exhibit implicitly the same good the Christian exhibits explicitly. Such a line would be neither Barthian nor Thomist, but perhaps that would be one of its virtues. Thank you.
Professor McKenny, thank you very much indeed. We're going to go straight to questions. We've got between 10 and 15 minutes. In order to allow us to get around the room, please could I ask that questions are kept short and concise where at all possible. There'll be mics coming to you, so feel free to put up a hand. We'll try to take people in order. Who'd like to go first? Yeah, down at the front.
Gerry, that was great. I'd like to hear you develop just a little bit more your third option, particularly in light of, say, Aquinas' distinction between the end of courage as a natural virtue, as bravery, courage in battle, versus the end of courage for Christians as martyrdom. They seem to be somewhat different ends or different emphases.
Yeah, one of the things I tried to do is avoid all the controversies Thomists get themselves into. Not being a Thomist, I feel that I can do that justifiably. But I think that there are different accounts that are given of that distinction. One account would be that the courage that's displayed in battle is not even a virtue at all, really. Aquinas, when he defines what a virtue is, it's clearly, he clearly states that it is not the Aristotelian conception of virtue. It applies to the infused virtues only. I think that's an extreme position that I think is almost certainly wrong. It raises the question that I think is so hard for Thomists to answer, which is exactly how is that, if that is a genuine but a lesser virtue, how is it related to the perfect virtue? Does one have both virtues simultaneously? Or does one have one rather than the other? So both of which raise all sorts of problems. How can there be two simultaneous perfections in a human being? On the other hand, if in some way one has the infused virtue rather than the natural virtue, then does that mean one doesn't have martial valor? The questions that are involved in answering those sort of questions, in resolving those sorts of problems, are to me they're the kinds of things that Thomists make their living on. But I think they're questions that are just best avoided. I think there are ways of avoiding the two sorts of goods, and you can have the same good exhibited in different contexts in different ways. You can have it explicitly articulated in Christian forms, which I don't think would do away with martial valor altogether. It would understand it in a certain context that may not be understood apart from a Christian context. But even, I would say, even then, a non-Christian could exhibit that virtue as a Christian does implicitly. So that would be I hope that's an answer to the question.
Thank you. Really good talk. It's become increasingly clear to me that phronesis, practical wisdom, is going to be an important area in dealing with some of the ethical issues around science and technology in future. How do you see that fitting into the kind of the Barthian Thomist framework that you describe?
Do you mean in general or on particular issues of technology?
In general, I think.
In general.
First question, yeah.
Yes, well, actually Nigel has said this very well. One thing that's really lacking in Bart is a concept of practical reasoning. So, I think the Thomistic question would be, what is practical reasoning as an acquired virtue, and what is it as an infused virtue? And you have all sorts of questions that go around that question. Bart actually does practical reasoning, but he doesn't do it with a theory of it. So I think that question is very hard to answer. But I think that Bart's best comments on it are actually quite helpful. He ways in which he says it should work. He talks about political judgments. Says that Christians don't begin any different from non-Christian, in any different way from non-Christians. We all sort of attempt to identify the goods and the harms in a situation. We don't calculate them or engage in any sort of quantitative analysis of them, but we ask what kinds of goods can be realized in a situation. But he then says the Christian goes on and does this in a way that's being done before God, in a way that the non-Christian doesn't. The problem is he's not very explicit about what that is, but one could easily translate that notion into some sort of idea that the Christian has sources for thinking about those goods that are at stake in a situation that the non-Christian doesn't. Of course, the Christian has the non-Christian sources too. That's the point of the whole first part, that Christians and non-Christians understand at a preliminary level these goods in the same way. So that would be more, I suppose, an example of putting into a context provided by revelation goods that are also accessible to non-Christians. And I think that's basically right.
I think Matt has a question.
Gerry, thanks very much for the talk.
Really enjoyed it. I wonder if there's a bit of Thomas that I think gets overlooked in some of these questions or in some of these conversations. At the very beginning of the Summa, he says something like justice is predicated on mercy, that actually mercy is prior, and that the work of creation sort of is, in fact, an act of misericordia. He uses that term specifically, which later shows up in, like a virtue of compassion, as it were, right? This reconciling, which is to say that it is, in fact, grace all the way down. Does that help draw them even closer together if we sort of step back and think about, like, at that dogmatic level, creation for Thomas being this work of mercy as the first act? Does that bring them even closer together on some of these themes?
Yeah, it could. Jeffrey Skaggs has just published a terrific book in which he has a chapter saying that Barth and Aquinas go together on precisely those grounds. But I think one could go even further and say that the entire way Aquinas discusses justice it's treated in such a way that the justice as an infused virtue doesn't violate justice as a natural virtue, but it in some way incorporates aspects of justice as a natural virtue, maybe reconfigures some things. You've got, of course, tensions between mercy and punishment and so on, but he deals with those sorts of tensions. So that particular discussion ends up being a nuanced discussion. I find that that when he actually does this with concrete issues like that to be much more persuasive than the things he says that lead one to think. And actually, he does say that natural virtues and infused virtues just run on very different principles of action. It seems to me that when he actually talks about justice as an infused virtue, it incorporates a lot of justice as a natural virtue while also transforming it. And I think that's, again, part of the way one would say that the Christian does explicitly what others can do implicitly, because I don't think the things that he says about justice as an infused virtue or justice as it's transformed by mercy are altogether lacking in pagan thought and in pagan practice, or at least among our contemporaries today.
Question from the middle, then we'll come down to the front after that. A bit further back.
I might have missed this, but you talked about how Thomas run into problems with the division between nature and the supernatural. And I'm curious about, in your third line, if there's still a place for nature, and for example, human nature, and if there is there profit in Christians talking to non-Christians about helping to discover what that is, or no, or not?
Yes, I think I'm attempting in that line to retain from Aquinas is the notion that that whatever grace does to us is a perfection of our nature. So one cannot speak of a perfection of our nature without speaking of our nature. I think what I find just difficult to surmount is the notion that again, as I put it, that God creates us with a good that's commensurate with our nature for a good that transcends our nature. I find that whole set of problems just one that it just generates more issues, irresolvable issues than it generates issues that can't be solved and doesn't really solve very many issues. So I think that yes, I would say that I would agree with Bart that nature is made for. Our nature is made for a certain kind of conformity to God's, as I put it, God's wisdom, justice, and goodness. And we're created for that. We failed to do that. We're now locked into the sinful consequences of our failure, but it's a problem of our sinfulness, not a problem of the limitations of our nature.
And is it helpful for Christians to talk about that, non-Christians?
Absolutely. In fact, I would say it's not only helpful, I would say that it's a necessity for Christians to understand themselves. And I would say it's a moral obligation to do so.
How much does it matter that on a Thomist account, historically speaking, one is created without the good to which nature is ordered, in the state of original sin, or in the case of Adam, created already in grace and therefore already ordered to the supernatural good. So that how much does it matter that the autonomy of nature is never historically a principle in the created order for Thomas? Again,
that's a great question. It gets us into a lot of questions about Thomism and so on. That it's not just that I want to evade those questions. That I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer them. But basically, the two schools of thought that have competed in recent decades have been the kind of neo-Thomist school of thought, which holds that nature has its own integrity. Grace is superadded, and that's the way it was in the state of integrity, and it's what we're restored to. There's another school of thought that says, well, the pure nature that has its integrity is really an abstraction. It's been grace all the way through. There are lots of reasons for preferring the second position, but the arguments that I've read for the first being closer to Aquinas' position have been pretty compelling to me. So the way I look at it, I think just in maybe in ecumenical terms, it's a real issue in ecumenical terms. Probably the Protestant tradition that has spoken to this the most clearly has been the Reformed tradition, which has argued that there was no superadded gift. Adam's integrity meant that Adam was capable of the perfection that God calls human beings to, and Adam and Eve would have achieved their perfection apart from sin, without superadded grace, superadded qualities, and that's just a very different picture than a picture for which Adam and Eve were created with their integrity. They were capable simply out of that integrity of achieving a good commensurate with their nature, but they were not capable in that integral state of achieving the highest human perfection. So from the Reformed perspective, I suppose, why did God create human beings incapable of achieving the highest perfection from the beginning? From that Thomist perspective, we go back to the Reformed and say, well, why are you assuming that that in their integral perfection, they wouldn't still be in need of God's help, but that God's help would come in a way that doesn't interfere with their own capacities? So these are the kinds of decisions that you just have to, or kind of positions that I think you just have to choose between in the end. And I choose the Reformed one.
A final question, yeah, at the back.
This, thanks for the paper. This is almost a pedagogical question that you may have just answered, but it does seem like the Barthian or Thomistic option has dominated the guild for so long. You've now rejected the via media. Is there something within the history of moral theology, a tradition that you might name and ally with in your third option? Or do you just want to say it's the biblical point of view?
Can I say both? Well, I didn't want to invoke the name here, but I think it's really Calvin's position. Yeah, and so I've said that. I've said it in this very Anglican college, but yes.
Professor McKenny, thank you very, very much indeed. So from one height to the next, Professor Charles Mathews next on the possibility and actuality of judgment, lessons from Augustine's City of God, books 19 and 20. Charles.
Gerry's paper is a little more like a Sugar Ray Leonard demolition of Nigel, in the sense of something involving technical competence and expertise and a fair amount of subtlety. That will be not my strategy. I always remember Mike Tyson's line, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. And I'm not actually punching Nigel in the face. I'm actually trying to raise some, if I can see him here. Is he here right now? Oh, he's way in the back. Raise some questions in deep sympathy with the larger project that he's engaged in. Let me just mark down, make sure that I know what I am. And I should start also by thanking Nigel in many ways for the many kindnesses he has shown me and my family and my students and humanity in general over the many decades that I've known him, and for making Oxford, especially over the past decade or so, the site of an interesting ongoing seminar in Christian ethics that I have been occasionally able to participate in. It's been a wonderful opportunity, and I hope whatever happens, you will continue to be a one-man wandering seminar. 80 years and 5 centuries ago, more or less, our ancestors, some of them anyway, and for some of us more metaphorically ancestors than others, brought forth from this continent a new idea of a globally interconnected world rendered intelligible and ruled by the conceptual inheritances, particularly of Latin Christendom, and dedicated to the idea that some sort of logic of global order involving the whole species might be a good idea. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that idea, or any idea so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. Like all civil wars since Cain and Abel, this one is particularly nasty. We are met near several little battlefields of that war: the Rhodes statue and the Regius Professor's lodgings. This battlefield, this latter one, is in some important ways about judgment. So I wanted to start with this large context to tell you something of what I take to be the stakes of this. I take you back to the ethics of empire controversy of several years ago. I won't go into the details here, but just notice that what was to me a crucial moment in an otherwise fruitless failure to engage, when I read the Oxford scholars' open letter decrying Nigel's project, simultaneously decrying Nigel's own view of the project and the project as a whole, which is an attempt to assess the ethics of empire, the idea that empires might be things that are in need of ethical assessment, they had this wonderful and, for me, very thought-provoking line: "Good and evil may be meaningful terms of analysis for theologians. They are useless to historians." This was an interesting thing for them to say, because their entire piece was luminous with a sputtering outrage of a distinctively ethical character regarding what they took to be the details of Nigel's position. In other words, they felt that his use of ethical terms was, and maybe even the explicit use of ethical terminology in general, wait for it, crucially unethical. They were doing that thing that I see a lot of people in the academy doing these days, to borrow from an excellent book of Mary Midgley's of a while ago, saying that judging is wrong and that making moral judgments is immoral. Now, you can argue with Nigel's judgments, and I do, after all, argue deeply with them, and I want to say, just for the record here, that bigger is not necessarily better. But you must still admit that you yourself are judging. And for example, I believe the legacy of empire is far more profoundly compromised and not just complicated, perhaps, than Nigel does. But I don't want to just chuck Bigger, right? So if I use his name as a joke, I have to use mine. What's also at issue here, and more deeply, is Nigel's ongoing attempt to introduce, or perhaps more fully articulate, self-consciously contestable ethical judgments into public discourse. I think this effort is wholly legitimate, wholly salutary, and wholly necessary. It needs more support, and I think I should support it here. Many today think it's best not to make moral judgments, at least not publicly. Sometimes this amounts to a kind of Pyrrhonic skepticism about reality. At other times it amounts to an almost prescriptive demand, a curious kind of Kantian self-denial of the sort that you sometimes hear in undergraduate classrooms and faculty meetings. It's always wrong to make moral judgments. This is particularly ironic now because the academy at current moment is saturated in ethical energies and campaigns, projects of liberation and equity and recognition. Most of the people involved in these projects, while certainly earnest and fair-minded, simply are not educated in the challenges and complexities of thinking ethically to be able to deal with the kinds of complexities and contradictions and tensions and compromises that a sophisticated ethical position will inevitably provoke you into. So we have a lot of moralism, but far too little self-consciously deliberate moral reasoning, and that is unfortunate. Moral judgment is inevitable and necessary and good. It's inevitable because we are moral creatures. It's necessary because as moral creatures, we value. And it's good because, and it is good to assess this because we can in fact exercise this capacity in better or worse ways. To make ethical judgments in public is hard. Such judgments are defeasible by the world and always contestable by our peers, and both sets of frustration, metaphysical disconfirmation or indifference, and civic disagreement are vexations we should learn to deal with in this world, exasperating though they may be. Absent some explicit and self-consciously disciplined practice of moral judgment, we are not only likely to be needlessly impolite to one another, we are also likely to be remarkably ignorant of better versions of the views that we ourselves hold. Furthermore, such judgment will only grow more important in coming years. We need to develop these judgment skills for living in general, but also for a far more pluralistic future than we currently inhabit. And we already inhabit a pretty pluralistic present. We live in multiple polities at different scales: the polity of a theology faculty, the polity of a college, the polity of a university, the polity of a town, and speak out of and to those different polities with a range of commitments and idioms that must be related to one another in multitudinous ways. And we must serve to explain ourselves to an ever wider and more diverse range of interlocutors as well. As Christians and as academics, as members of multiple kinds of polities that we want to relate, we need to figure out how to do this. In fact, everybody does. Given the widely felt obligations to engage in ethical projects and the normally experienced challenges facing ethical judgment in our world, an unapologetic, open-minded exercise in the practice of public judgment is philosophically necessary as well as civically useful. And this is something that Nigel's work has provided. His public judgments operate on two levels. First, he offers a series of judgments and provides what he thinks are reasons for holding them. And then he invites people to disagree. By rendering it explicit, he makes it possible to have a more interesting and intelligent conversation. At least that's the hope, right? We all go wrong in very many different ways, but that's an admirable hope, it seems to me. And by doing that, he's invited others to also, as it were, up their ethical game, to render articulate and intelligible far more lucidly than they have the kinds of views that they themselves profess. Now, one of my charges in this paper is to think about how Nigel's work helps us understand the relationship between Protestant ethics and other disciplines, and this is one way that it helps. For in my experience of the academy, many disciplines are increasingly caught up in thinking about profound ethical issues, but Protestant theological ethics is one of those very rare places in the academy where the practice of judgment is self-consciously taught and cultivated in a disciplined, intellectually rigorous, and historically informed manner. That is one very great value that Bigger's work provides. And in that sense, Bigger is most definitely better. Now, further to help in this task, though, I want to look at an early moment where someone struggled with the difficulty of judgment, in a way recognizably, in some distance, like our own struggle with judgment, and also in an interestingly analogous, though far more focused, pluralistic context, and that is the figure of Augustine. I want to explore the nature of judgment in a theological ethical idiom, and I want to use The City of God, books 19 and 20, to do so. These books are about human and divine judgment, and they are sometimes treated separately, but I want to treat them, for reasons I'll say in a minute, pretty tightly together. To do this, I want to start by offering a few comments on Augustine, as it were, before the city, and then I will to contextualize him, and then I'll say a couple large points about Augustine in the city, and then I'll wrap up by offering a couple little quick things. So let me start here, first of all, by reminding you of something that I think we don't often register enough, and that is that we don't notice how different ancient politics is from modern politics, and how important the differences are for understanding the context in which figures like Augustine were working. Today, we live in a world engorged with order. We live in a heavily legalized and bureaucratized world. The entire discipline of sociology has developed to, in some ways, explain to us the many ways in which we are, in fact, creatures of systems of order that are far more technical, far more explicit, and far more rational than even 150 years ago humans had ever imagined. This is a relatively new phenomenon. In the ancient world, order and its quintessence, justice, were by no means an everyday and easy and straightforward occurrence. Humanity chronically suffered from a vitamin deficiency of justice and order, even simply of a predictable application of law. And speaking abstractly, ancient politics happened essentially in public precisely because it was an attempt always by the relatively limited powers of relatively small state forces to demonstrate and authenticate and legitimate themselves before a context in which state power was always something that most people wanted more of. Explicit and almost theatrical acts of judgment were much more visibly a part of ancient political life. Like so much in the ancient city, justice, both trial and punishment, was done, importantly, in public. And this was at least as important for the law as it was for the criminal. For judgment was justification not only of the judgment, but legitimation of government itself. To be a king was to be a wise judge. To be a wise judge was good evidence that you were king-worthy. And agents of kings or emperors, such as Roman governors, typically spent a great deal of their time judging. I believe it was Cicero, though I might be wrong about that, I haven't had time to check, who said in his time as governor, he would spend the summers in war and the winters in judging. Right? Summers for campaigning, winters for judging. Judgment was thus not only about the event being judged, but also expressive of the government's meaning and its insistence that it was the social form properly in charge of worldly affairs. Professor O'Donovan has written very eloquently and powerfully about this. I'm just kind of summarizing some of the historical background here. The fact that acts of ancient government were also more fundamentally punitive and reactive than proactive is revealing as well. Ancient government was small and weak when compared to our world, and so it was more reactive than proactive, and much more actively retrospective than prospective. Today, government produces policy. In antiquity, it mostly performed judgment. This is above all true for the Romans. A large part of Rome's legitimacy in how it presented itself to its subalterns, and insofar as we can tell, even in how those subalterns understood their obedience, lay in its claim to establish and deliver a fundamental justice and law, a kind of rationality and predictability around the Mediterranean and beyond that allowed life to go on. The Romans, in fact, thought quite explicitly about politics in terms of law and judgment. And this is interesting because the Greeks did not. The Greeks were actually quite suspicious of languages of law. It was, in fact, a feature of Roman political thinking to think in terms of law. And thus it should be no surprise that Rome saw the question of involvement in civic life not centrally in terms of citizenship per se, although of course republicanism is very prominent in Rome, but in terms precisely of serving the public good in some official state-formed capacity, and centrally in terms of serving as a judge. The classic scholar Miriam Griffin once put it, the thesis sitne sapiensis ad rem publicam accedere, that is, whether the wise man should serve the public, was in the late Republic and the Empire one of the favorite exercises of the rhetorical schools that was taken over from the philosophers. Right? And we'll see this, of course, famously for those who are nerds like me in City of God 1906. Right? So that the City of God 1906 has this rhetorical and generic background that we often don't realize is there. All right, all of that is just a background to Augustine. Let me say a little bit about Augustine before the city. Augustine actually is interestingly hugely interested in judgment. A quick word search of the Brepolis corpus, which is a large online database of ancient texts from broadly the 2nd to the 8th centuries, suggests that roughly 21,000 references to versions of Judic, of the root form of judgment, is available in this text, of which 6,000 are from Augustine texts. Almost a third of the Brepolis database's references to judgment are from Augustine. And this, it seems to me, if I'm right, and I thought I checked this out, but now I'm anxious that I failed to do it in the proper way. This actually means that judgment is a more disproportionately focused interest of Augustine verbally than gratiae, which is an interesting idea. Like Augustine is more informed, more in line with other people on that. And more specifically, interestingly about the city, we'll get to this in a minute, but I'll just point this out, that in the city there are 386 sentences that talk about judgment, and almost half of them, 153, are in Book 20. So once again, we have a very interesting moment where it's clear that the terminology is what's at issue here in some important ways. Now, this is the kind of weird nerd scholarship that you can go deeply into nowadays, and it's not really recommended. It's worth also pointing out that this is in fact this question of thinking about judgment in this way is a very, very large and interesting innovation in Christian circles in Augustine's day. In the post-Constantinian church, and I don't mean by that a polemical category of Constantinian, I just mean by the middle of the 4th century and then accelerating onwards, there's an interesting way in which judgment begins to be a question of positive use for Christians, but before that, it was almost entirely negative. In fact, the semi-Pelagian text De Divitis on riches, which sometimes is associated with Pelagius, sometimes not, but in general, I would say, just as a weird historical claim, Pelagius and his followers were often far more traditional Christians than Augustine was. I'll leave that alone for right now. He has this wonderful line where he says, "Just as once Christ stood before the judge, in no way should Christians ever presume to be the judge now." So there's already this kind of heavy suspicion of this kind of civic service in the world that Augustine is using. And yet Augustine, systematically, as a person, historically, as a rhetor who was simultaneously a literature and law professor, and then later on as a bishop in the Episcopal Audiences, actually does engage in a practice of judging, in part on civic grounds. Right? I mean, the role of the bishop was not just an ecclesiastical court in that way. He was, in that way, something more like a small claims court figure, for Americans, a kind of Judge Judy. Now, all of this is related to an interesting theoretical fact about Augustine's theological epistemology, and then more specifically his theology of judgment, which I'll say here. At the very earliest stage of his Christian career, in fact, Augustine undertook a threefold theological epistemology. First in his Contra Academicos, against the academic skeptics, then in his De Utilitate Credendi, against both skeptics and rationalists like the Manichaeans, and then finally in his De Magistro, he offers a theological picture of how the human comports itself epistemically in the world, how it comes to know the world, and how that knowledge is routed through other metaphysical realities. Certainly, Augustine was, in these early texts, caught up in an early enthusiasm for Neoplatonism. As George W. Bush said, "When I was young and foolish, I was young and foolish." But actually, these dialogues demonstrate not only a kind of, at times, but actually much more minimally than we might say, at times an enthusiasm for a kind of straightforward Neoplatonism. They also suggest a remarkable maturity of philosophical insight, manifest in a deeply critical and indeed self-critical apprehension of humanity's epistemic situation in a post-lapsarian world. While he definitely developed and changed many of the views across the next 40 years, I know of no evidence, and indeed that the epistemic views enunciated in these three remarkably early treatises were ever revoked or even substantially reformed. Right? There's no evidence of this in the Retractationes in any event. Indeed, these views are reasserted at multiple places in his later texts, in De Trinitate and in De Civitate Dei. For a mind so restless, so given almost compulsively to reconsideration, the stability here is remarkable. Yet it is not often, if ever, remarked upon. To borrow from Sherlock Holmes, the stability is the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime, the dog that didn't bark. Right? So epistemically, and in terms of his understanding of how the human understands the world, Augustine's thinking actually interestingly came to what seems to be an early maturity. This is in some ways me trying to hide under the wing of Carol Harrison, but not entirely. Furthermore, Augustine's theological epistemology is also related to his profoundly deep theology of judgment, on which there have been several. Well, there's a good book and a very good dissertation that I hope will come out from one of Professor O'Donovan's students. Ron Haflidson wrote an exceptionally smart, I thought, theology of judgment, on Augustine's theology of judgment. What's important here is that as time went on, Augustine, who had begun with the surface rhetoric, at least, of Roman legal practice and thinking about judgment, thinking in broadly forensic terms, he moved to a much more quickly pedagogical and then even, if not sanative, at least psychagogical picture of how judgment actually interacts with the world. The judge who judges not only the objects in the world or the people in the world who need to be judged, they are also implicitly judging themselves. And that activity of judging is also always, at best, a participation in the Holy Spirit's, a participation through the Holy Spirit of the divine judgment of the world. In other words, much as Augustine's theological epistemology is all about how you cannot know the world except through God's knowledge, you also cannot judge the world except through God's judgment. So understanding God's judgment turns out to be a very decisive feature of what it means to judge at all. This is, by the way, kind of a sucker punch to Nigel, but we'll get to that. We'll get to that later. Like Augustine's overall epistemology, wherein we know by knowing in God, Augustine's theology of judgment is one wherein we participate in the Spirit's judgment. So this makes judgment not so much an Aristotelian syllogism, but rather something more dynamic, less formal, and less about us judging, and more about us being judged. In general, Augustine's thought, then, was attentive to judgment, often transformative of its pre-Christian Roman and pre-Constantinian Christian understandings, but the text where he most explicitly talks about this is the city, to which I want to now turn. Now, a couple quick points about the city in general. First, I take it to be the case that the city is not really a polemic or an apologetic text, but more centrally a pedagogical text meant to offer a kind of Christian grammar. Thanks. It's good that you're only giving me, I only have 5 minutes to actually say the main point of my talk. This is the sweet spot for me. This is really good. The second point is that, again, I want to underscore how important it is to think about 19 and 20 together. Oftentimes, all of us will think about Book 19 as about political judgment, and Book 20 as about ecclesiastical or theological or eschatological judgment. And in fact, it seems to me quite important that Augustine doesn't do that. Structurally, they're the two beginning chapters of the last set of 4 books in the city, and they are clearly meant to be read together and in complicated, as I want to argue, dialectical interchange. Doing otherwise can miss the important way that the 2 books play off of each other. Let me say something quickly here about what Book 19 is trying to do. In some important ways, Book 19 is about the desacralization of worldly politics. In a sense, the world is endless, in the sense of being without a determinate teleology. There are no ends in this world. There is only cessation. Worldly politics repeatedly founders on its own always latent apocalyptic longings. And thus, in a certain way, he teaches a kind of learned ignorance about worldly affairs in Book 19. The story of the judge, famously in 19:6, is importantly about how the judge is compelled to act in a situation where their acting is done in a fear and trembling of a deep, unconscious unknowing of the realities of which they are participating in, and yet they have to act anyway. Right? So they cry out in the words of the psalmist, "From my necessities, deliver thou me," not in some way as an addition to their act of judgment, but in a sense as the consummate recognition of the way that their own activity of judging is a form of their own being judged itself. Right? They are meant to be suffering in this judgment. Now, in all of this book, Augustine undoes the ancient political legitimacy of Rome, right, which, as I pointed out, promised immediate and immanent justice to its inhabitants. Instead, Christian justice and judgment are always eschatologically deferred, and so we must wait for judgment from God. And yet there is an end, and there are judgments, and these are real, and they are happening now. Augustine's proposed secular agnosticism is part of a larger and deeper theological, as it were, Gnosticism, in the proper sense of knowledge. The judgment is here. The apocalypse is now. This creation is what is being redeemed. In a way, all we can know is God, and that's what Book 20 tries to talk about. So in a sense, you have to understand Book 20 and what Book 20 says about judgment to understand what Book 19 says about our incapacity to judge. Now, in fact, you might think that 19's vigorously skeptical demolition of this worldly wisdom will lead into a triumphalist trumpeting of the power and security of faith in Book 20. But that's not what Augustine says. Here is a representative quote near the end of that book. This is a great little thing. He says, all right, throughout this whole thing, we've learned that the following things are going to happen. And he lists a series of things. And he says, but how they're going to happen and in what order is something that the experience of the actual events will teach us then far more fully than any human intelligence can grasp now. My own view is that they're going to happen in the order in which I listed them, but I might be wrong about that. Right? This is actually echoed in an exchange he had with the Bishop of Salona, Hesychos, in his letters just a few years before this. At the end of a long letter to Hesychos, who had been a very kind of vigorous apocalyptic, he says the following: the optimist is heard with more pleasure, the optimist about the world ending soon. The pessimist is heard with greater safety, that the world will not end anytime very soon. But the one who admits that he does not know which of these is true, hopes for the former, endures the latter, and is mistaken in nothing, because he does not either affirm or deny any of them. And then he says to Hesychos this wonderful and I think epistemologically charged moment. He says, I love you for affirming what I want to be true, and the more I desire what you promise, the more I want you not to be mistaken, and the more I see danger if you are mistaken. Right? So in other words, Augustine is well aware of the psychological compulsions that allure us into this as well. Now, what's going on here? Why is this longing for an apocalyptic clarity something that he experiences as something we have? Well, I think he actually has an answer for this at the beginning of Book 20, this wonderful, mysterious passage from chapter 2 of Book 20. Consider, he says, the distribution of good and evil in our world and the deep moral obscurity that a clear-eyed assessment of that distribution would suggest. For the world is deeply obscure. Punishments and rewards seem not to track with any moral pattern whatsoever. It is not only that good is not always rewarded, nor is it that by and large good is reliably rewarded and evil punished, nor is it even a matter of the inversion of good and evil, so that good gets reliably harmed in this life while evil predictably benefits. It's rather that, in general, good does seem to get rewarded and evil does seem to harm itself, but the exceptions are so vast and broad and frequent and unpredictable as to make the general pattern not sufficiently visible unless one squints one's eyes really hard. It would be easier, he says, if such cases displayed some consistency even in their absurdity. But all we have, it seems, is a kind of randomness or noise. Now, given these facts about the obscurity of the world and our longing to make that obscurity go away, how does Augustine resolve these things? In fact, he says, our moral condition should make us feel the experience of distentio ever more fully. We should understand in our judging that we are always to be torn apart by our experience of the two sides of our position. We need to live our pains and longings more fully. But this means that our state as being redeemed in this life will not simply be a matter of perfected achievement, provoking happiness and cheering, but as much imperfect striving with as much painful longing towards a full and final realization. We have to unlearn many things, and one of the words that Augustine uses, borrowing from Cicero, hardly anyone else uses this, is this fascinating word, dedocere, unteaching. One of the things he wants to do is unteach a number of things. And the reason we have to do that is so that then we can experience through our striving in the world this more full distentio, this more full tornness of our situation. All right, let me end with one final thing, if I may. One of the most interesting pieces of Nigel's work that I have found, and it's, I think, programmatic to a lot of the historical, more popular work he's done, is this piece, I think it actually came out in Providence magazine, called History, Not Hegel. And it's interesting to me to think about the way that the field of history in the past decade or so has genuinely become a site of interesting moral debate. It hasn't become a site of sophisticated and self-conscious moral debate, but nonetheless, the fact that we have many people thinking about this in both the UK context, in the wider world context, definitely in the American context, it seems to me that history has once again become a kind of magistra vitae, a teacher of life. Nigel's work on this is very important. He has ancestors, of course, in a curious way. He's doing something that's akin to what E.P. Thompson once described as his attempt to recover from the enormous condescension of posterity, the past. And Oliver Donovan has also himself had this wonderful line from The Desire of the Nations where he says that there's a deep injustice and that the figures of the past did not get to live to see the completion of the history that they are a part of. It's a wonderful idea. We live in a moment where this experience of the moral weight of history has gripped us again. And on our world, this grip is powerful and profound. Augustine's advice to us is not to run from that, but to live into it as fully as possible. Not only in our judgments on ourselves, to make those judgments as frankly and honestly as possible, but always to reveal our own vulnerability and susceptibility to countercharge and critique in them. And while I have a lot more to say, let me end with this final line from another recent resident in part, or at least a nearby resident in part of the Southwest Lodgings, W.H. Auden. This is a useful bit of advice for you here at the end. For all of us thinking about doing judgment in this way and thinking about how we are also receiving judgment at the same time. Do not imagine you can abdicate. Before you reach the frontier, you are caught. Others have tried it and will try again to finish that which they did not begin. Their fate must always be the same as yours, to suffer the loss that they were afraid of. Yes, holders of one position, wrong for years. Thank you.
Charles, thank you very much indeed. Let's go straight to questions. Who'd like to go first? Nigel. Are you ready?
Chuck, thank you so much. That was characteristically feisty. Two things. One very simple. You mentioned in passing the Greeks were suspicious of the language of law. What did you mean? And secondly, what was the sucker punch?
It was, unfortunately, Edward bullied me out of it, but the sucker punch is largely that it feels like a lot of your public work has been more overtly moral, which is obviously necessary, but not embedding that morality within a larger theological picture of recognizing mercy and judgment. And that if I were to have advice for you, rhetorical advice as your PR officer, I might say that you missed the chance to have a kind of evangelical moment in some of these things, precisely in the way that in so much of our public discourse right now, the thing that is most profoundly missing, it seems to me, is any awareness of mercy. And as a theologian, that might be something, and I'm not chastising, I'm just saying this is something I think you could do more of. So yeah, he wants to reply.
Let's be candid here. Are you telling me I'm too combative? Or I mean, it's true. I am sometimes.
No. Not that you're too confident, but that you're too finitely moral in a way, and you don't recognize the ways in which, in the writings that I see, there's a kind of nice closure of a piece in a way that doesn't allow the possibility of a kind of really other view to come back and judge you. And also, I think this recognition that in our judging, we are always and more fundamentally the ones being judged. If we could find a way to articulate that and render it visible in public, I actually believe that might be going somewhere useful for us. Yeah.
I'd like to follow.
Sorry. All I meant, and this is not something that is unique to me, is that when Greeks think about the nature of politics and things like that, there is some attention to the question of constitutions, but most of it is actually not about the work of ordering a society through law, per se. It's actually through activities and dynamisms and assemblies and things like that. It's not. It's a useful fiction, but it's one that is not original to me. I think the Romans actually said this as well. We use the idiom of law in a way. Yeah.
question, referring back to the start of your presentation, about the idea that we are more just and ordered in modern society. And I'd just like to refer to the idea about jus and the idea that justice is about community and a communal living together. And the work of people like Grace Davey, Putnam and Campbell in the States, and Jonathan Fox on the idea of pluralism, and the analysis that we are more individualistic, certainly in Western liberal democracies, and that community is lacking, and how that reflects on the idea that we're more just as a society today.
That's a great question. So my view is broadly, I'm comfortable with people being concerned about the decay of Gemeinschaft, of community, and the rise of a kind of anomic individualism. But I am more convinced that, especially in the humanities, we need to attend more to that line of scholarship that goes from Weber through Elias to Foucault in some ways, and talks about the way in which we are a far more disciplined species now than we have ever been before. And the way you can talk about that in terms of the decline in interpersonal violence outside of state systems and things like that. The Roman world was far more violent, both in terms of feuding and in brigandage and things like that, than our world is. If we had a nation today that looked at the Roman Empire, it would look at the Roman Empire almost as a failed state because of the failure to keep security on the roads and things like that. So when I talk about order, I really am talking about that overall structure in which, in the modern cultures, we have become increasingly disciplined in that way. That doesn't mean that we are, in that way, thickly gemeinschafted in that sense. In some ways, we can have more individuality, precisely, and that individuality may be more diffusively non-interacting with one another, precisely because the stabilities of our social order are such that we no longer have to be as directly and immediately invested in collectively sustaining them in an active way. That, I think, is true. When was the last time Oxford college students killed the head of a pub in Oxford? Not for at least a century, I think, right? So, at my institution, students, we created an honor code because students at one point in the 1850s killed a professor on our main campus grounds. They shot him, and that's what I mean. That when I talk about being more disciplined, we are much more in that way disciplined today.
There's a question down the front, then Brian.
Thinking partly of Professor O'Donovan's talk yesterday and some connections which we might forge between his and yours, could there be a public or communal practice of distentio, or is that inherently an individual or subjective experience? And if there could be a public or communal practice of it, what might it look like?
I wrote down, I don't know if it was Professor O'Donovan or somebody else, but I wrote down the line, common practices of lament or common litanies of lament. In a larger way, we are collectively in our own bad ways all engaged in civic liturgies of self-abasement these days. And some of that is problematic shame, but some of it is probably a salutary self-critique. I do think it would be useful for churches and, in a different way, other institutions, perhaps educational institutions that are not related to churches, to think about ways that they could invite people to enter into and host institutional settings where we gain a richer and more morally nuanced awareness of the world that we live in. The metaphor in America is moving from a honeymoon to a marriage. The recognition that you're in a compromised and complicated place. I wish we had more of those things. Again, not to move in a kind of Jacobinite direction and throw out the past, but to in some ways come into a fuller and richer appreciation of it. If I had more time in this paper, which we'll just take now, I would say one of the interesting things about Augustine on judgment is precisely that Augustine is one of the first, if not in some ways systematically the first, great unmasker of human history. You have people like Tacitus and others, and Thucydides, but in some ways they are embedding their story in terms of these are the kinds of natural things that humans will always do. Augustine is actually doing something slightly but importantly different. He's saying that Ever since Eden, we have been living a lie, and we don't want to tell ourselves it. And I'm going to tell you. And let me start with Rome, right? And that activity of unmasking is, I think, one of the energies coursing through our current situation. But what Augustine also had was, along with that unmasking, this continued sense, a Christological sense, that the judgment is also embedded in a declaration of mercy and forgiveness and redemption. So in a way, we've kept part of this energy but lost another part.
Thank you, John, for that. I wonder if you could make a little more explicit what it might look like, or with an example, or maybe a principle for making public moral judgments in pluralist contexts that we make with some conviction, but hold with a kind of provisional humility that invites dialogue, but also manifests a self-judgment. What's that look like? What's that look like?
Thank you. Yeah, so provisional humility here is a good term for it. I don't mean to say that we're diluting or weakening our own conviction of this, but that we recognize that even as I really can't imagine right now some other way of understanding the situation. In my experience, I've always turned out to have, other people have turned out to have useful things to say to me that do change it. So even though I can't understand what that change would be now, I'm willing to do that. I would say this, so in our world, not in Augustine's, we're more recently to our world. My favorite example of this kind of work is actually from Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural, which reads the Civil War, as he says, right, as the justice by which God has given the due punishment to North and South for the crime of American slavery in that moment. And this is maybe not, I think, any political advisor would say today, a necessarily successful way in the short term of upping Lincoln's poll numbers. Because if you say to people who have just suffered this horrific war, in a larger sense, we all deserved this. That does seem to me, though, a very important evangelical and pedagogical moment, that there's a form of justice that's being done here. You don't have to agree with the content of that, but that activity. I have received this justice. The Lord is always going to be right in this sense, so there must be some way in which I have to learn from this. And therefore, I have to find some way of going forward from the situation. That seems to me the kind of thing. And then, you can say that Lincoln's context was very different than our own, but it seems to me that there are other ways of transforming that picture to see the way that we ourselves are always working out of a history, whether or not we admit that it is our history, is an important part of what we're doing. That's why I started with that first paragraph, which is echoing the Gettysburg Address, for those of you who don't immediately pick it up. And the question of our ancestors, which is so thoroughly fraught, and Professor O'Donovan and I went back and forth on yesterday. Definitely our ancestors in the sense that people I have studied and want to believe in were the ones who created the kind of global world order that we live in over the last 500 years. Many of the debates we're having now are in some ways about whether the heritage and structure of that global world order can actually be expanded enough to include the numbers of actual people who live in it. And so while I appreciate the value of having ancestors in the sense who are, for me, from places like Oxford, it's also the case that I think we have to think about how to hear those other voices as well in this way.
Professor Mathews, thank you very, very much indeed. There is one final question. We've got 30 minutes only as a short break until the next one. So we'll pause there, take tea, come back and pick up the conversation. Clearly do carry on during the break. But thank you very much indeed.